everybody. Welcome to Read Science, and today is the happy birthday edition. Happy birthday to my co-host, Jeff, and I'm going to turn things over to him for first announcements.
Thanks very much, Joanne. Today's episode is special for reasons other than just my birthday. This happens to be the first episode of our third year doing Read Science.
Oh,
which I think is very exciting, and we are revisiting a topic that we first talked about nearly 2 years ago. The subject is cancer. Today's guests are author Sue Armstrong, whom Joanne will introduce in a moment, and George Johnson, author of the Cancer Chronicles, Unlocking Medicine's Deepest Mystery. George Johnson describes himself as, I'm quoting from his website, a writer working from his office in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which I'd say is true if over-modest. He also wrote that he was, quote, more comfortable with the sharp edges of cosmology and physics than the wet, amorphous, ever-changing terrain of cancer, which is pretty much how I feel about it, too, being a physical scientist, but I'm here to learn. Of his 9 books to date, the 2 next most recent were The 10 Most Beautiful Experiments from 2008 and Miss Leavitt's Stars, The Untold Story of the Woman Who Discovered How to Measure the Universe from 2005. He's been shortlisted 3 times for the Royal Society's Winton Prize for Science Writing. He's a co-founder of the annual Santa Fe Science Writing Workshop. He's written for a number of magazines that are familiar to all of us, and he is currently writing a monthly column for the New York Times called Raw Data. Thanks very much for joining us from Santa Fe, George.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Okay, Joanne.
Oh, and I get to introduce Sue Armstrong, who I think this hangout's been about 6 months in the works here. I was looking back at when I first corresponded with you, Sue, because I was looking, well, what do I add to her bio here? So Sue Armstrong is a science writer and foreign correspondent who has worked for a variety of media organizations, including New Scientist and BBC World Service. Since the 1980s, she has undertaken regular assignments for the World Health Organization and UNAIDS, I hope I said that right, writing about women's health issues and the AIDS pandemic, among many other topics. The author of A Matter of Life and Death, Inside the Hidden World of the Pathologist, and today's book, P53, The Gene That Cracked the Cancer Code.
You've got the wrong one there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Back here is P53.
All you white books
there we go.
spots on them. Okay, P53, The Gene That Cracked the Cancer Code, both by Armstrong, and she lives in Scotland, and we're on a little later than we planned originally. My fault. Totally my fault. You can't trust me with world clocks. Sue, welcome, and say hi to our audience.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be with you, and happy birthday, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Sue.
Yeah, Jeff, one of these years will hit my birthday, and yeah, we won't tell anybody my age, so we'll do that. We'll keep it a secret. That's the one old-fashioned thing I happen to like.
Yeah. Okay.
Jeff, why don't you start off with a question for our guest?
Well, and let's keep it big for a moment, because it seems to me that one theme that keeps coming up in these cancer discussions that certainly is behind every chapter of both of these books is how big the question of what is cancer, one word, but the thing's so big, and even more profound, now that it's my birthday, I can recognize that and say how much cancer understanding has changed even in my lifetime. And so I'm going to quote something from George's book that I thought said a lot about that. This is your essay question. He wrote, "Things are rarely as simple as they seem, and what appears to be complex may be no more than ripples on the surface of a fathomless ocean." Oh, it sounds portentous, but things have certainly changed, and the way we thought we understood cancer when Nixon was president, we'll get to that, is a lot different from the way we understand it. So, in 50 words or less, George, would you like to survey everything that's happened in the past 50 years?
Sure. I mean, really the key idea is that cancer, unlike any other disease, it's not an infectious disease, although sometimes infections can trigger a cancer, but cancer is an example of Darwinian evolution going on in your body in a very sped up manner. And the way I like to think about it when I was writing the book is that it's almost like a little quasi-organism or a quasi-creature or would-be creature is trying to evolve inside the ecosystem of your body. And what from the point of view of us, the bodies are dangerous, deleterious mutations are, from the point of view of the cancer cell, advantageous mutations. It's becoming fitter and fitter, and to the detriment of its host. So I think the really key idea, you can trace it back, quite a few decades, but many people look at a paper written by Peter Knoll on what was called the clonal selection theory of cancer. And basically the idea is that, cancer randomly generates mutations and then they're selected for fitness. And that's why it's so extremely difficult to treat, because whatever you throw at it, it's likely to evolve a workaround.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Sue?
I would say, if I might answer that also, I would say one of the big difficulties of cancer is that, in a way, it's just ordinary life got a little bit out of hand.
Yes.
And that's the terrible thing about it. That's what makes it so desperately difficult to address, because it is, to a certain extent, one of the great mysteries is when you have a wound on your arm or something like that, it'll fill in the space, and somehow your body knows when the wound has reached the surface and it stops. But with something like cancer, it can be the same kind of thing. It's the same filling in holes, it's the same multiplying, and it's the same ordinary growth systems, but they just don't know when to stop. Or it's death things which don't know when to happen as well. So it takes over the general systems of living, and they just keep going. That's the problem.
You two are going to agree vehemently on this as well, that cancer is almost a thing that is just a consequence of being alive, that it is part of being alive, that it, as you say, Sue, and as George has also written, it uses all the mechanisms of living, and this is where it comes from, why it's so multitudinous in its forms, and also why most of us can't escape it if we live long enough.
Yeah, it's essentially, I'm sorry, it's again, a way I think about it, when I write about cancer, is that it's really an inevitable consequence of the fact that we're multicellular creatures and we're living in a world that's governed by entropy. Things fall apart. As things get more complex temporarily, it's only at the expense of creating disorder somewhere else, and eventually the system's going to break down. So if you don't die first of heart disease or a stroke or something like that, at some point you're going to have to die of something, and it's likely then to be cancer.
As we go back to Sue to finish this, I mentioned to Joanne that I read in the New York Times David Quammen's review of George's book, and there was an equation in it that seemed perfectly summarizing the book, and you just mentioned it. He wrote this equation. He wrote down entropy times mitosis times time equals breakdown. And I think this is something that we're going to be talking about a lot as we try to understand, I don't know, the simple view of so much going on. And now, passing back to P53 certainly has a lot of stuff going on just with this one protein and this one gene. And boy,
it does. One of the things I was going to go back, just to rewind a little bit to what George was saying. One of the things that's fascinating is, yes, if we live long enough, we're bound to get, we're almost bound to get cancer. It just happens, just because of the number of times everything's dividing. But one of the great mysteries is that very big animals don't necessarily, it's not necessarily proportionate. You don't get much more cancer in whales or in elephants than you do in human beings. So there isn't a direct relationship between how many cells you've got and how often they divide and cancer. So there are lots and lots of little mysteries. But then one of the things I found fascinating about studying biology is that it is it's so beautiful, and yet it's also so messy. You think you've learned something, and then something comes from around the corner that says, "Oh yes, but," and so that's the thing. You can never say.
There's always an exception.
Exactly. There's always an exception. Yes. Sorry, to go back to your thing about P53.
No, that's fine, and you made me think. You were talking about large animals. That reminded me that we learned in George's book that we like to think in popular culture, I think, that cancer is a modern, man-made thing that comes from living life dangerously in the 20th and 21st century. And now we find out from George that dinosaurs had cancers, that the earliest identifiable hominids had cancers. This is something that has always been around, and something that happens to everyone, and again is part of life. And you gave a number. I've got it someplace about the percentage of cancer sightings in the archaeological record. But that's a pretty fascinating place to start. But we're not the only one that gets cancer, and it's not just because of, I don't know, 20th century chemical processing.
Well, yeah, that's something that was one of the big surprises to me when I started delving into this subject, back around 2010. I mean, I guess, if I knew, I knew then, if I really thought about it, that the cancer must be, something that's been there ever since you had multicellular creatures, because cells are constantly dividing, and every time they divide, they have to copy their DNA. So inevitably, you're going to get errors, and inevitably, in an imperfect entropic world, not all of these errors are going to be corrected, which is a good thing, because it's the random mutations in our germ cells that have allowed us to evolve. And you're thinking about all these things. But the really interesting question is to what degree of the assaults of the 20th century and 21st century civilization may have increased the amount of cancer. I mean, of course, we know that smoking cigarettes has, but let's say you take cigarettes out of the equation, and in one of my chapters, I tried to trace back and just find the best case we can make for how much cancer there was in the past. And once you get really to the late 19th century, there's really nothing like good medical statistics and death records. There was a study in England and Wales in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, that was really the last thing that's considered even semi-reliable. And there was one paper that analyzed that and subtracted and adjusted for things like the fact that smoking cigarettes wasn't such a big thing then, or that people were more likely to get stomach cancer for various reasons. And this scientist concluded that you really couldn't make a case that cancer back then was at a different level when you made these adjustments than it was today. So controversial, because there are so many assumptions and variables.
I found that a fascinating chapter in your book when you looked at Love Canal and the assumptions that people make that, there's nasty things happening in the water and nasty things happening in the air, and there's cell phones and all this sort of stuff. It must be giving us cancer. And you so carefully sort of filleted all of that and looked at it. I found that deeply fascinating, because I know it is one of the big, it's one of the big controversies. Nobody dare say anything about about how much chance is involved in getting cancer and so on, without everybody piling in, because it's such an emotive issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
As Joanne and I were saying, we were talking about this the other day, that Bert Vogelstein and colleagues had said something which was picked up by all kinds of newspapers around the world, and just slightly mangled, and it caused a hell of a hoo-ha. And in fact, they were just looking at it exactly the same sort of things as you were talking about in your chapter, George.
Yeah, I wrote one of my columns about that, one of my raw data columns, because I read the paper that originally I was given a copy by a friend at the National Cancer Institute, an advanced copy, and I read it and I thought, this is great. I mean, this to me just seems so obvious right, that there's a much larger role for randomness and entropy than most people realize, which doesn't mean you have to be fatalistic or that you can't prevent many cancers, but it's saying, let's see which ones we can prevent and let's see which ones are probably mostly the result of randomness, and then try to prevent those, and the ones we can't prevent, are the ones that maybe we can try to treat or even cure in some cases. But it was a brilliant paper, but the reaction of the public, and then when I wrote about the paper defending it, the emails I got, people are just outraged by the idea that cancer isn't caused because you're not eating kale chips or because a Dow Chemical and maybe these are factors, but particularly kale chips are a very minor.
Well, but there are
factor.
at least a couple of things that have come to mind in those things. One, we can't really have that discussion about the epidemiology of cancer and understanding it, because it's still recent that we understand cancer as a genetic problem, as a problem with genes.
Yeah.
But
I mean, what you say, it's true that we. I'm sorry. You can go on and continue, but
no,
I
was just going to add into that mix in that we're still seeing a lot of people clinging to the idea that the mysterious disease cancer that is still not understood popularly has to have a cause, and their favorite cause is moral impurity or unclean living or some punishment for something. This is hard to fight against.
The AIDS debate all over again, isn't it?
Yeah. Most any debate, it seems like. But
I mean, I guess I would argue that even if we had no idea what the mechanisms were of cancer, and we know an amazing amount, but even if we were completely ignorant of it, the epidemiology would still allow you to show that certain things were likely to be risk factors and certain things are not. So
yes, because for a long time the smoking thing was very much just the epidemiology, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, very much so, and that's what's so interesting, because smoking, for an epidemiologist, the deleterious effects of smoking cigarettes were just such a strong signal in the epidemiology that it was just hard to ignore. It's like a risk factor of like 20 times. It raises your risk of lung cancer. Almost everything else you look at, whether it's a chemical pollutant in the atmosphere or red meat or anything you want to look at, it's just a tiny fraction as big a factor, like so small that it's often indistinguishable from noise. So there's very little that they found in epidemiology that's as clear cut as cigarettes.
But actually, that's where P53 is so nice, because it clinched the case against tobacco, because when they discovered that the products of tobacco smoke actually mutated the P53 gene, the tumor suppressor
gene, I remember that
in a very specific way, and that really clinched it. And what they found was that people who were smokers and had lung cancer nearly always had this mutation, and it was never in lung cancers of people who hadn't smoked. And so that was a fingerprint mutation, and they found quite a number of them. I mean, I think there are 3 or 4 already. I mean, skin cancer has got one, and liver cancer caused by the Aspergillus fungus on moldy peanuts and that sort of thing. So there are 1 or 2 very specific fingerprint mutations on the tumor suppressor gene, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. But as you say, for so many other things, they can't find an absolute fingerprint. There isn't the definitive proof yet. And there isn't actually, as you say, sometimes there isn't even that strong a connection or an indication from the epidemiology, is there?
Well, no, that's true. I mean, they're more like suggestions, and then of course there's the standard thing we see where one study comes out, particularly about some food, and then the next study comes out completely refuting that one, and back and forth. But it's because we're dealing with signals that are just at the level that they're almost indistinguishable from noise. I really liked in your book how I hadn't really. I knew that P53 was involved in so many processes that can be corrupted and lead to cancer. And I think I had a line in my book somewhere that said, after making some of those points, that if you want to start a cancer, take down P53 because
Yes.
domino effects. And but I didn't really appreciate to the extent of its pervasiveness until I was reading your book. So it's just it's really it's a very interesting way into the subject. I think I think whenever you take a huge, overwhelming subject like cancer, you need to find. Like I think of it as just like this big amorphous sort of swamp, and you have to kind of cut through, and then every person who writes a book is going to find a different path through the subject, and it's interesting to see what how different people pull that off.
Well,
Right,
I did think.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was wondering how many of our viewers actually go, P53, what's that? And I was hoping, so you might be able to back up just a little bit. And wait, before I do that, if you are out there and you have a question about cancer, we do have the question and answer app on. And if you type that in, our guests, I'm sure, will be thrilled to do their best to answer. Yeah, Sue, why don't you back up a little bit and talk a little bit. Obviously, if you want to know everything about P53, you should read this book. But in simple terms.
What is P53? I should have said that right at the beginning. Yes,
that's okay. I'm a cell biologist. Those of you who watch me enough know this. And to me, this book was absolutely fantastic because all the exciting things that were the initial discoveries that were happening as I was in grad school. So of course, I'm trying to get an idea of what's going on with it. So it's still unfolding. So it was great to read this book and see the whole story and the number of people you interviewed. And we'll get to that in a minute, but please do tell us.
Okay. Well, very basically, P53 is one of the genes that's in the DNA in every cell in our bodies. And one of its tasks is to, as a sort of proofreader, as a sort of quality controller, to ensure that when only healthy cells are allowed to divide and replicate themselves. And so it keeps a watch, and if signals come that the DNA has either been damaged by some outside force or during the process of division when it's copying itself, if the DNA, which is the blueprint, the recipe for the cells, the recipe for living, if that's damaged, P53 will stop the cell in mid-division, send in the repair team to mend the DNA, and then set it on its way again, the cell on its way again. If the DNA can't be mended and the cell looks as though it's going to be dangerous, then it can cause the cell to commit suicide. Because the big difficulty is that if the DNA is messed up, you need just one rogue cell, and that can trigger cancer. And so it tries to clear out cells that are, while they're dividing, it tries to clear out the ones that are going to cause a problem. And that's its main task. It's the sort of quality controller across our bodies. And it was named by one of the people who discovered it has since called it the guardian of the genome, because it guards the integrity of your DNA as our cells are dividing. That's basically it. And it's called tumor suppressor gene.
And P53 has to do with the weight of the actual protein.
Yes, it has a terribly prosaic name, as so many of these genes do. They found it, and they found the protein, and it weighed 53, whatever the units are. And they didn't know what it was, and they didn't know that it was going to be anything that special. So they just said, okay, protein that weighs 53. And that's it, and that's how it stayed.
This was before they started coming up with all these wonderful names for genes. Like, we had the hedgehog gene, and then the sonic hedgehog, and the desert hedgehog.
Didn't you?
Drosophila, the little fruit fly that we use as a model, those scientists are really well known for their crazy gene names. So that's really
good. Cancer too. Yeah, there's twist and so many of them that they're coming to me in a rush and blanking out.
There's a lot, but I just don't know why they left P53 with such a pathetic name.
And
the thing is, there's a when you leave your employment in Britain, you've got something called you get given a P45 form, and so many of my friends keep calling it, oh, you've got the P45 gene. Anyway,
that's wonderful.
And it is the most important tumor suppressor in the body.
Yeah, but we don't know how to we haven't figured out how to exactly target it to cure cancer, because sometimes maybe P53 mutates or another protein comes in that can sort of ameliorate the functioning of P53.
Mm-hmm.
So just because we found this really important central protein doesn't mean we can capitalize on it to cure all cancers,
No.
even though it seems really important in most cancers, if not all.
That is one of the really big questions. I mean, I remember when I was first started doing articles on this and so on. It was in the sort of late 90s, and they thought, now we've been studying this gene for long enough, we feel we're at a time when we can really capitalize on all the information. And you know, and then suddenly they start to dig away. They think, now we know it. And there's just layers and layers and layers of the onion skin. And when you try to address it, it's just so hard. Because what you have is P53 at sort of the center of the whole system. And either P53 itself can be messed up, so it can't do its quality control thing, or you get other things which communicate with P53 to say there's a problem. They can be hamstrung, or the things that P53 switches on to do its job, they can be messed up, and so you've got just so. Oops.
It's just the sound switching that Google does. It's not to be alarmed. It's her delivery.
You've just got so many things that can go wrong, and so it isn't just a question of let's learn this.
Well, and it goes beyond. You've got the mutations that cause it not to do something, the mutations that cause it to miscommunicate, the mutations that cause it to overactivate and do something. And then you can start talking about how it gets folded and whether this particular folding causes this or whether this particular folding doesn't cause that. And it seems like sort of the one thing we know and is still getting unraveled is that P53 seems almost always to be at the center of the action. And that I finally understood when I was getting, say, to the last third of your book, Sue, the gene that cracked the cancer code. I'm thinking, what is it that we're talking about? And the answer seemed to me to be that understanding how cancer works could be illuminated extensively in all of its complicated facets by seeing the various ways that P53, who's almost always on stage, is getting involved in what's going on. And there's so many ways to do it. And that is back to the rhetorical question I was going to ask earlier. When I remember, I was not all that old, but I was not all that young when President Nixon declared war on cancer, and the idea was that we were going to find the cure for cancer. And my question is, do you think that declaring war was premature when we understood the enemy so little as we did in the early 70s?